Welcome to 28storms.com. I am Jason Moreland, and this is your tropical cyclone update for this Wednesday, February 16th, 2011. The area of low pressure over the Northern Territory has strengthened into Tropical Cyclone Carlos in this general area. And we also still have a tropical low off the western Australian coast, which is still likely to become the next tropical cyclone over the next 24 hours. We also have the potential for development further east, and we'll get into that in a couple moments. Here is the latest forecast from the Australian Bureau of Meteorology. As you can see, Carlos is forecast to meander ever so slightly into the open waters, where it will have more room to work with and intensify further into a Category 2 cyclone on the Australian cyclone scale. The only inhibiting factor that's really forecast to prevent the storm from strengthening further is going to be land interaction. As you can see on this graphic, the storm is supposed to hug the coast throughout much of the duration of the forecast track as it moves on over to the southwest. Now, the forecast intensity will be a bit trickier than normal because any deviation away from this track will either place the center more toward the inland areas where it won't intensify, or it could push further off the coastline and have more time and room to strengthen into a stronger cyclone than forecast. So certainly there's going to be some interesting days ahead. The latest forecast track from the Joint Typhoon Warning Center is also in similar agreement. It shows a general southwest track as the storm stays just off the coast of the Northern Territory before making a secondary landfall along the northern half of Western Australia. You may also notice the slightly darker icon noted here for the 18th of February, which signals that the forecast intensity is expected to reach 65 knots, which would place the storm on a Category 2 intensity status if this were the cyclone scale in Australia. So there's a fairly strong agreement between the two agencies at this time, not only in terms of track, but also with the forecast intensity. Here's the latest visible satellite animation, and it will tell you a couple different things about the tropical cyclone over the Northern Territory. First, the circulation is still most certainly hugging the coastline, with half of the circulation still over land. You may also notice that some of the highest convection or strongest convection is located well to the north of the center. Now, this can happen for a multitude of reasons, but the two primary reasons in this case is, first of all, there's more moisture to work with over the open waters to the north of the circulation, but there's also some pretty good, or at least light to moderate wind shear coming out of the south. Here is another look at the storm using a more zoomed-in version of enhanced infrared satellite imagery, and as you can see, much of the convection is located well north of the center. Here's the center here, and it's pretty much void of all of the highest and deepest cloud tops, with most of those well to the north. So you may be wondering, why is this wind shear in place? Well, you have to look at the upper-level wind analysis, and sure enough, we have a very strong upper-level ridge located over the eastern Indian Ocean. And while that ridge is ventilating the developing tropical cyclone to the west of Australia, it's also acting to funnel in some southwest wind shear over the Australian continent. If you look at the shear tendency map, it may show things a little bit better. So the favorable area for tropical cyclone activity is located within the middle of the ridge axis, but on either side you still have a pretty strong jet max of vertical wind shear. And as you can see, that wind shear is spreading into the Australian continent all the way up until you get to Tropical Cyclone Carlos. The latest water vapor animation also shows this fairly well. As you can see, we have a developing tropical cyclone just west of the Australian continent, and although that system has fairly good outflow, there are some southwest winds streaking toward the northeast toward our developing storm over the Northern Territory. And as you can also see, some of the cloud tops from this storm are beginning to be shunted off to the north. Now here is the latest 200 millibar forecast from the GFS forecast model, and you will see a similar picture at 0 hour. So as you can see, we have this area of upper level ridging over the Indian Ocean where our developing tropical cyclone is, but over toward the east there is a slight increase in vertical southwest winds in response to the jet max between our upper level ridge and the long wave trough to the southwest of Australia. So we are seeing those southwest winds, as was noted by the SIMS shear tendency analysis. So is this really going to keep up, and will this inhibit the tropical cyclone's progress over the next few days? Well, if we go through some of the forecast time frames, you will notice that the upper level ridge will remain in place, and in fact over the next 18 hours we may see a slight increase in the southerly winds, but that's not expected to be too much of a factor. And as we move into the next 48 hours, as our storm system begins to move toward the southwest, we will see a gradual increase in upper level ridging over this general area. So, as the storm continues to move toward the southwest, upper level conditions are expected to become slightly more favorable. So once again, the main deciding factor in terms of how strong the storm is going to get will be how much land interaction will occur over the next several days. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the other model guidance. This is the latest 12Z ECMWF forecast. This is the current time frame, but as we go into 24 hours, you will notice that the storm over the Northern Territory is beginning to move into more of the open waters and is beginning to intensify. We also have the tropical cyclone over to the west. By 48 hours, we don't see much in the way of motion actually. The storm is going to be nearly stationary over the Timor Sea near the coast of Darwin, and there's not going to be much change in intensity based on this forecast. By 72 hours, though, the storm does look a bit more intense, and it's making a more of a southwest jog into the coastline of Western Australia. So this is a bit of a mixed bag in terms of news because we will be seeing a secondary landfall along the Western Australian coastline, but it will be better if the storm moves inland a bit sooner and doesn't have as much time to strengthen. By 96 hours, which is Saturday, February 19th, the storm has made landfall, but it's still relatively close enough to water so that it will not weaken too significantly or terribly fast. In fact, it looks like it's going to maintain its status as a tropical cyclone for at least the next 96 hours. By 120 hours, the storm is still hugging the coastline, and by this point, it's also approaching Port Hedland. So, areas all along Western Australia should keep a close eye on this storm system, because like I said, there's still some question marks as to how far north it'll be. If it's further north, we'll be dealing with a stronger cyclone even 120 hours out. So this is going to be a very interesting setup, to say the least. By 144 hours, the storm is still wreaking havoc across portions of the Australian coastline. But this is getting into a very far time period where the models do not become as accurate as they ordinarily would be in the short term. And I should also draw to your attention this new development over here in the Southern Pacific, and this has been a constant trend in the forecast models for the past several days. So even though there's not much going on in the South Pacific right now, a lot of model guidance is indicating that we will have a tropical cyclone in that area within the next 5 to 7 days. The tropical cyclone that's been west of Port Hedland and Exmouth is still well out into the southern Indian Ocean based on this model run, and is really not affecting anyone except for shipping interests. Now here's a quick look at several of the ECMWF ensemble members, and they're all in generally good agreement with a track over toward the southwest over the coming days. So why are we so confident with at least the general forecast track? Well, currently, if you look at the low-level steering analysis, you will notice that there's a mid-level ridge over Central Australia. Now, there's also a slight weakness over Western Australia, and that weakness is forecast to be nearly semi-permanent over the next week or so at least. The European 500 millibar forecast shows this quite clearly as well. As we go into day one, there's the Central Australian ridging, and then off to the west we have a slight weakness with the broad long wave trough passing toward the south. By 48 hours, that trough is a bit deeper. By 72 hours, day 3, that trough is setting up perfectly well over the Western Australian coastline, and by 96 hours, the pattern remains fairly consistent. We still have the main core of upper level ridging off to the southeast, which is opening up a fairly good track over toward the southwest. Now, although Carlos most certainly deserves the most attention at the moment, I don't want to ignore the fact that the Joint Typhoon Warning Center has initiated advisories for that system to the west. It's considered Tropical Cyclone 16S, and their forecast keeps the storm just offshore throughout the period. I see no reason to disagree with the idea that this storm will remain off the coastline, as that's what the model consensus would suggest, along with the synoptic pattern. Nevertheless, areas within the cone of error still need to keep a close watch on it just in case the models were to shift further toward the east. But nevertheless, we still think it's going to remain off the coastline even though it will be strengthening and kicking up the seas quite a bit over the next few days. Now, before I leave you, I do want to touch on the possibility for medium-range tropical development in the southern Pacific. As of right now, there's not a whole lot going on, but as you can see, there is a lot of isolated thunderstorm activity and convection located east of the Solomon Islands and northwest of Fiji. As you can see, there's a fairly large mass of very disorganized convection. Now, currently, upper-level conditions are not conducive for any type of organized convection. We have an upper-level low located toward the southwest over the Coral Sea, and we have a secondary upper-level low located southeast of New Caledonia. It's located between New Caledonia and New Zealand. So it's a really volatile upper-level pattern right now, and I don't expect anything to happen within the next 48 to 72 hours. But over time, if the ECMWF model is correct, the upper-level winds are supposed to become a bit more favorable with some of these upper-level lows getting out of the way. And if there's any remaining broad area of low pressure with isolated convection, then there's a chance that that might become the focal point for tropical cyclogenesis down the road. So that's all the details now here at 28storms.com. We're still going to be anxiously awaiting to see what that storm does over the Northern Territory and how far into the open waters it will get before making a southwest track toward Western Australia. We still expect Tropical Cyclone 16S to remain off the Western Australian coastline, but areas right along the coast are still, encouraged to really keep a close eye on that storm. And then, as both of those storm systems begin to wind down, the focus may begin to shift toward the South Pacific later on, as we may have some tropical low pressure begin to form east of the Solomon Islands. So once again, thanks for checking us out here at 28storms.com. Please subscribe to the feed at youtube.com/28cyclones, and also visit the Cyclone webpage at 28storms.com/cyclone. You will see a wide variety of links to the Joint Typhoon Warning Center, Bureau of Meteorology, several forecast model links, including the latest news information, and the live news wire coming from Google News, along with the latest Twitter updates regarding all of the cyclone action around the Australian area. So once again, thanks for checking us out, and come back and visit soon for more updates.